just do a little bit of an introduction. I'm aware of many hats, but most recently I've been piloting a company around called Bloom. We do data visualizations that are mostly games that help you understand the data that you're embedded in all the time. Most of the time what we're looking at are social network data and media data that you have access to, but all of this also spills over into location and becomes something a little bit more akin to AR. Last year, however, I gave a big presentation about how I thought AR was not about personal technology, but instead the idea that media was going to begin welling up around us in the environment into connected devices that were actually in the architectural environment or in the room, the idea that we had profiles that would be fluidly bringing provisioning to all the objects around us. And so, reality would be augmented, but not through personal mediation, instead through environmental mediation. So this time, however, I'm talking about another aspect which is not directly related to sort of the tight, kind of industry definition of AR. Instead, I'm talking about people, and I'm talking about what happens to people when they're embedded in this type of environment. I think there's kind of, we can sort of, at this point make a set of assumptions about the type of technology frameworks that people might be living in the future in terms of how connected they are and what those services provide to them and how the environment is maybe providing some of that information to them as well. But what are the new forms of sociability that arise out of this context, and how do people really adapt to this sort of cultural moment? And I'd say to sort of get to where this cultural moment is, we have to go in the Wayback Machine pretty far back, in fact, to kind of the beginning of something that might be the Wayback Machine, which is the beginning of language. And I would say, to sort of bring the scope of AR as far out as possible, language is, of course, the first augmented reality, right? I mean, reality was something before language, but it became something much different and much more complex and much more sociable once language is added to it. So the idea that, our ability to layer meaning on top of space is pretty much the very foundational meaning of civilization, the foundational meaning of consciousness in a way, and sentience, and the way that, for instance, tool usage arose in primitive man. But it turns out if you survey the living world, there are many, many modes of communication that are actually quite a bit more, one might say, efficient in the sort of, the sort of map-reduced world that we live in, of like giant operations happening simultaneously. Things like intracellular communication that happen in chemical media are quite a bit more efficient than language. They're not one-to-one, and they are a ton of different high bandwidth signaling that goes on all the time. And this is the sort of thing that we're now enabling ourselves with the technologies that we're building. The idea that we have ambient awareness of huge groups of people all the time, and the ability to sort of change our focal depth and how we're paying attention to them and how they're relating to the scene around us. And I think that's one huge issue in AR that we haven't really dealt with that much yet, is the idea of other people, right? Everyone's talking about, oh, I can pull up a menu around this object, and I can sort of understand what's going on in the environment. But the real baseline of communication, that's sort of what we found with the social software explosion on the web, is that really once you add the people, that's kind of the bottom line. So one of the things that'll probably be happening in the way that people relate to each other, you sort of, in network communications, you have to have a formal definition of who's inside of a group and who's not. It's sort of the analog to what provisioning is in the hardware environment. This idea that you're provisioning a set of people that are going to be inside a different set of permissions about how you're communicating, right? There are different levels, basically, of sort of formalized intimacy that you have with these different sets of people. And that's already, there's kind of a brittle version of that already exists in social networks that we use every day. Facebook allows you to declare whether this person is a friend or an acquaintance. But as we go, there are going to be tons of different levels of and kind of valences and facets of groups that we communicate with, and the types of information we trade with those groups will become very different and sort of specialized. So what this means is there's this sort of proliferation, this dynamic explosion of the types of groups that people might form. Right now, in the type of what I would call paper society, there's this there are formalized groups that exist in a lot of different settings, namely the family, the workplace, the sports team. I think I have a slide on that. Different, sort of different things that you might imagine, ways that people come together. And these types of modalities can now all be sort of adaptive to the situation. You might find yourself in a family situation that becomes a jam band situation or a sports team situation, at any moment, based on the types of tools that you're provisioning for yourself and the types of tools that people in your environment are provisioning. Both the environment can be adapting to the types of things that the group wants to do, and you can be adapting to each other and sort of beginning to form new types of social experiences in the context. So, there are a couple of kind of characteristics that these types of groups share. As their bonds start to grow tighter, they begin to share media faster and faster. Maybe not even, explicitly asking, requesting, and sending media, but instead being opened up to different flows of sensation that they all have enabled in their own tech gear, I think, as we were describing in the last session. So, the idea that group sensation becomes something that's happening, that people are sharing their perspectives dynamically, and thus, as people move through space, like say as a group of people experiencing a city as travelers, you would have something that is like a mini map that's showing you where everyone is, showing you what their statistics are, showing you what they've flagged in their environment, maybe what their video feed is. All of these things are happening in real time, and it's sort of this expansion of an envelope of understanding of the space by a dynamic group. Another thing that, sort of as a byproduct of that is this idea, Microsoft has this thing called photosynth, and Google's been doing a lot of 3D modeling of spaces using multiple perspectives to derive 3D objects. Well, if you have multiple people in a space and they're all simultaneously gathering mediation, then you have a way of modeling a space that's much more dimensional than you would have if you had a single point of reference. So the idea that a team that is experiencing a space has already a higher resolution model of that space than an individual, that can just be, it's almost like you've kind of pooled your resources in terms of sensation. So, of course, kind of timely, there's this idea that with AR, we're all superheroes, but the question is there a reason why we all need to be the same superhero in a situation? So, the prospect, it's actually kind of interesting. Avengers is kind of this interesting moment because we've had a ton of movies that are about, I guess X-Men is another team superhero movie, but we've had all these movies that introduce those characters individually, and they all solve problems that were sort of based on how their superpowers worked. But then there was this interesting, the main plot really of Avengers is how they figure out, based on their own singular problem-solving strategies, how do they learn how to take advantage of each other's strengths and weaknesses. And so, the idea that you maybe are someone who, through your characteristics, the way that you spend time, you actually know a lot about music, you know a lot about music in a city, somebody else knows a lot about driving and navigation, so as the two of you come together, there are roles that are generated for you automatically. This person's the driver, this person is going to select the soundtrack. There are ways in which that type of delegation of roles in kind of a multi-person system can happen fluidly, and ways of mediating that over time. The idea that you could vote someone in and out kind of almost transparently from those roles is also quite possible. So there's also something about not just seeing things together, but digesting them together. I don't know, everyone probably knows that, usually a couple that's like a brand new couple of people, that have just started going out, and they're trying to build a shared sensibility about things. They want to confirm that they think about things in the same way. And so, someone sees something and says, that's cool, but really, instead of saying that cool, they turn to their partner and say, isn't that cool? And their partner says, yes, that's cool. And only after that response, it's like, okay, we've both decided that that's cool. And so, the idea that, similarly, there'll be all sorts of, reference checking, basically, between participants in a group that are experiencing something. It happens at a show all the time, like, this is my favorite song, as an announcement to friends standing next to you as you're listening to the music. And so everyone's kind of modeling each other as well as modeling the space and understanding how each other's opinions are matching up to the environment. And then the thing that I think is most interesting about this is that, there's this way that people could invest their capabilities in one person of the group. The idea that it's actually a network of resources that are fluid around the group. And so, if somebody is on the ground and they don't know where to go and somebody else is up in the building looking down on the ground, you can say, give me your eyes. And that person then says, okay, I'm now looking down at you, and your AR situation is giving you the heads-up view rather than the street view. And that idea that you have all of these capabilities that are within the superset of people, and those capabilities can be focused in different individual actors depending on the situation, is also, I think, something that's really powerful and something really new. The idea that there's kind of a construct of capabilities that then you're factoring things out of based to the different players in that construct. Of course, when you're talking about this sort of thing, WoW is really a good reference. This is the thing I think is really interesting, is that there's, of course, a group of people that have been living in AR for a really long time. It's just that the world that the AR is overlaid on, it doesn't exist. And so video games provide just a bazillion resources for how we're going to model these interfaces, because people already use them. They've already done the testing because they're in it every day. I mean, many people spend more time here than here. So, that the idea that there are all of these, okay, we have, this is a really complex environment. Especially, I would say, the thing that I find most interesting about the WoW HUD is that in the lower left-hand corner, there's a chat, which is a mix-in chat. You can have multiple different channels. You have your party, you have your group that you're participating in, your guild, the room. All of those things are inline chat that all just keep going by, and you can decide to scope that however you want to. You're like, okay, I want to participate in physical space. I want to participate in this social space. I want to participate in this dynamically generated space if people are interested in the same thing. All of those things can be layered into one stream. And I think that's also something that we're going to see a lot of. But, in general with WoW, the idea that you have, your contacts are on a mini-map. They have status bars for various different things. They have, you have ways of seeing what the things, how those people perceive the things in the environment as objects. You can target things collaboratively. There are just so many tools that already live in these spaces that will, I feel like we can just sort of export them one by one back out to the real world. And of course, with social networks, especially as they get closer and closer to real time, with Twitter, there's this idea that is related to the idea of the couples that are confirming for each other whether they like something or not. This is just sort of this idea that an ambient awareness of people, especially, I think family, there are a lot of use cases around the idea of family just being able to ping each other. There are like 1,000 physical computing projects about the little locket that you squeeze and warms up on your lover's chain or whatever. It's like just this whole idea that there's like just constant pinging, like, yes, I'm here, are you there? Yes, I'm here, sort of, what was that, Sirens of Titan or something like that? That was like, I'm happy that you're here, I'm happy to be here. And then of course the ultimate kind of, coordination, that you see exhibited in the animal world through this type of, tiny hinting about intent is collective behavior, right? The idea that the sort of flocks and the swarms and things like that are non-verbal, they have nothing to do with language, but they have everything to do with micro communication on all sorts of different bandwidths and the way that, things kind of adjust to that. So the idea that, like flash mobs are kind of like this super rudimentary, low resolution, kind of concept of that, which has like basically one keyframe, like be here at this time. But there's a lot of, as you have these super high bandwidth communications of hinting about, what you might do and how you might assemble and what and what direction you might all take, whether it's a physical direction or, an emotional direction or a, productive direction, all those things can be really turned into these real-time coordinated experiences. And then, this is a crazy abstract concept, but the chemotaxis is a word that I coined because chemotaxis is the way that cells communicate in a chemical bath. They're emitting proteins, and those proteins are used basically as communicational signaling. Other cells are receiving those proteins and saying, oh, okay, there's more cells like me over this direction, I'm gonna go that way, or there's danger over here because this cell left a marker there. And all that stuff is happening on an autonomic level. It's not really a conscious process. It's just like I'm leaving tags behind in the environment. I'm leaving a wake of communication. And so as you get this massive set of people inside something like a city that are all communicating in that way, you end up with this huge accretion of data about how the city behaves based on people's social interactions there. And of course, ultimately you end up with these layered contexts. Everyone's probably participating in multiple groups at the same time. So, the people's capability to that's the sort of focal depth thing I was talking about, the idea of moving between frames, like I'm in the family frame and now I'm in this other workplace frame. And all those things can, potentially bubble up in people's foregrounded consciousness or be dismissed based on other things coming to the foreground. So the idea that, this is not just about networks, but about layers of networks. And it's really, people, I think, as their literacy grows in their own contextualization and data, there's going to be a lot of metaphors that are developed to help people sort of translate, between these layers and move around inside the layers and communicate between them. A lot of that's basically what, communication networks become almost n-dimensional in the ways that they can make connections between contexts. And of course, ultimately, this becomes a living, dynamic environment, both, physically in terms of the kind of mediated architectural environment, but also socially in terms of how we build these roles together and what we decide to say that we're doing. I mean, right now we have a lot of organizational divisions like the workplace, for instance, which I think, as architecture becomes more dynamic and social groups become more dynamic, you could eventually see a time where groups come together dynamically into spaces that are provisioned dynamically to work on specific projects and then are dissolved and then come together again in different contexts. So, the idea that we become, virtuosos in constructing both these organizational groups and these physical spaces around them in order to become sort of optimally productive or optimally entertained. I think those are sort of the coming opportunities in both these kind of social contexts and physical contexts. So I would say, there is no one solution for this. There are some design patterns, I think, that involve looking at how AR tools can do hinting, how people can receive information, on all bandwidths available, and how people can understand the complexity of the networks that they're embedded in. I think those are the sort of core patterns for a whole host of applications that spring out of these problem spaces. But I think we're just, barely at the beginning of all of these trajectories. So it's a pretty exciting time to be thinking about all this. And I think that is the end. Yes.
After that tour de force, I feel like everyone needs a moment to digest for that question. But if you are brave, please come up and actually take the opportunity to come to the mic and ask. I was going to grab it.
Bravery and foolishness close to each other, I suppose. Yeah, that was quite a fire hose. I'd be curious if you wove all those, and there are really rich points I was feverishly trying to capture and trying to remember, but if you wove all those really rich kind of main points and the subtopics, what's the core narrative that you'd like us to take out of all that you went through?
I just think that, what we called social networking on the web is going to seem so feeble in like 5 years. Just the idea that was even remotely social or remotely networked either. So I think, the fact that we're just headed into this whole phase of, kind of cultural collaboration and understanding that's happening on a bunch of, its complexity is becoming our native habitat, I think is really what that comes down to. Uh-oh.
That was the very definition of thought-provoking. Really good. I'm wondering if you're given much thought to like visible seams and all these sort of contexts and layers, because in sort of paper society, if I'm in one sort of imagined social realm and I talk to somebody from somebody else, from some other social reality that's commonly seen as a gaffe, right? Or just some kind of misstatement of like, I don't have the proper contextual cues and I say something that just seems like stupid, offensive, right? And in this sort of virtuoso sociality that you're describing here, it seems like it would be very, very easy for me to trip over some unspoken boundary. And it seems like it would need some kind of visible differential permissioning, sort of like this isn't the part where we talk about porn, whatever.
Yes,
so
talk to the hand.
I'm just wondering, in this kind of like super seamless world, I'm wondering how one designs seams. I mean, how could you like make these things visible?
Yeah, no, they're definitely, gaps are important. Minding the gaps is definitely important. And I think, I think part of that is that, there's this, not to be crazily singularitarian about it, but there's this, obviously people that are going to have these tools there's going to be a huge gap around them anyway, because there's going to be a bunch of people that are just like, why the hell are all these people on the same street corner, going in that direction? It's like there's already a widening gap between people that are inside that type of system and outside, which is kind of, I think potentially has a lot of problems right there. But even people inside such a system, I think part of what we do is come up with, like, I would say that human expression almost always is about breaking the medium that it's working in to make those types of, gap minding kind of breaks. And I think, so whatever sort of seamless experience you provide, there's immediately going to be lots of hacks that allow people to make their little, sort of tribes. I think it's part of the safety of going into an environment that's that fluid, is that you still have something that's your own, some sub-language that's happening inside of this other meta-language. So I think that there'll still be tribalism that's not defined by the system. People won't give that up. So, but it's true. Those are the in design, one gets caught up in the utopian vision of, some kind of seamlessness, and that's just, I think, a pipe dream for the most part. But considering that we all know the current state of AR technology, that I don't think that seamlessness is really anywhere close to hand yet. So.
I'd like to continue with your biological metaphor. It's a really good one. In the human brain, all the information coming in from our senses moves through the thalamus, and there it's kind of inhibited globally, and only little parts are let through, so it's kind of filtered continuously. And one of the ways that we're able to say, well, what filter should I be applying to this, is through this hypothesis testing area, the prefrontal cortex, where it says, okay, well, let's pretend as if we did this, and what sensations would I expect to see out of such a situation?
Yeah.
Hey, thalamus, what do you think about that? And so do you see a role for a hypothesis testing, kind of an automated hypothesis testing?
Definitely. Well, I think, in a way,
As to what worlds to go into.
Right, exactly. And so I think that's the, it's funny because we're sort of exporting things out of the game world into AR, but there's still a huge place for simulation as well. I mean, I think, most of what our company does is actually design simulations that are not rooted in the real world, but are rooted in different conceptual models that allow you to explore information from different perspectives. And I think those tools are actually, the sort of tools of kind of collaborative decision-making, especially in things like urban planning and things like that, where it's like, what's it going to be? And there's a way, of potentially mapping that back onto, an AR of the world. Exactly, yeah. So there's like the possibility space that you're sort of opening up, and then collectively doing that sort of flocking into.
Nice.
Anyone else?
So in our work on polysocial reality, in our last paper, we talk about anopticism, which is the inverse of a panopticon in terms of making people the program.
Yeah.
Do you concur with that? Is that?
Well, I mean, I would say certainly if you spend any time in the Anopticon, I think, is alive and well already. I mean, the social web has done that too. If you spend time in the Mission in San Francisco, it's sort of the peer-produced reality TV show of everyone sort of mediating everyone else. I don't know if that's what you're getting at.
That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about, we're kind of interested in how you defragment individuation in terms of single device,
right,
single process, single program. And part of that involves distributing it out into the public and making the people that are using the program part of the program in terms of filtering preferences, grouping, and stuff like that. Does that concur with the?
Yeah, well, definitely. I think this idea of dynamically adaptive social systems that are, bringing resources off of the network into either physical space or computational space to service the group, based on an aggregation of whatever their specializations and needs are. The idea that it's all kind of a fluid system of participation in that definition. I think maybe that's what you're still not going.
No, it was a great talk.
Thanks.
Perhaps one more question, because there's a few minutes and this is a break next. So.
Well, yeah. What was the question? Let me set this up for a demo as well.
Yes. iPad. No, we haven't tried the iPad.
We'll see what happens, but let's just do questioning in the meantime.
I don't know, have any of you seen some of Ben's company's Bloom's Anopticon or Bloom?
Biologic.
Yes, Biologic. Biologic. Because I think this isn't just an abstract talk, it's actually grounded in some work that his company Bloom's been doing. So perhaps, maybe, as there's a few moments.
Yeah, we'll see if this works out. Is it going? Okay, excellent.
That was awesome.
Thanks.
So I guess, the MMO comment hit home with me. Tried to explain why I'm into them for a long time. But almost all of them are violent, or not violent, but combative. PvP is really what keeps people around.
Yeah.
Second Life, you could say, sort of failed.
Actually, did you ever see A Tale in the Desert? Do you remember that? That was it came and went, but it was specifically a collaborative, productive MMO. One of the other hats that in my past I wore was the designer of something called The Game Never Ending, which was became Flickr. But it was a massively multiplayer online game that was about that type of collaborative productivity. Flickr was the first tool like, I'm going to be the photographer, I'm going to be the music maker, and there was going to be a whole scenario around that. Anyway.
Absolutely. I mean, well, most of your points talk about, this having a social impact for better, and I think most of us would play something that's more akin to Second Life, but just curious what you think about, just the role of that thing, right? World of Warcraft made so much money because it was combative.
Yeah.
Does AR need that aspect, do you think?
I don't think so. I mean, I think that there's, outside of gaming, there are tons of social contexts that are, there are sublimated combative things like sports, but there's definitely a lot of contexts that people are sort of collaboratively social in that aren't that. And I think that's part of what leaving the space of the screen allows you to do, is have these different kind of experiences. But I think there's obviously also room for that as well. There's always going to be shooters. I think that's the game's number one rule in games. But let me just talk about this really quickly. I think this is Biologic. This is our latest application at Bloom. This is a way of looking at your social network data as a cellular metaphor. So you have every person in your social network becomes a cell in this organism, and every post that they make becomes a little organelle. There's Bruce. So you, yeah, I was hoping to find some tweets about my talk. No. Anyway, the idea here is that this tool, not surprisingly, evolves, and the idea is that you can, learn more about sort of the landscape of your network rather than the way that Twitter presents things right now is as an ordered list. And I think ordered lists have kind of become the sort of default, it's sort of like Fordism, you can have any kind of car as long as it's black type of thing. It's like, Apple is just like, it's going to be a scrolling list, and as Twitter and Facebook. So, what are the other ways that make sense to start to understand what's going on in these situations? Because they're all very dynamic and have very many variables. And so how can you build metaphors that look at that? So here we have, the size of the user means that they've been very active recently. You can filter by different types of posts. So we're going to turn off everything but videos. There might not even be any video posts. Okay, so there's 2 video posts in the network right now. This is the last 200 tweets. So Biologic. And so, the idea is that these are the types of, kind of dynamic, integrative views that we can have on these types of landscapes. And then the other thing I was going to do is sort of a little sneak preview here of something else we've been working on. This is a flocking application, which is just a demo of some, I don't know if you can really see that. These are a little bit dark. Actually, I'll show you a different part of it. So the idea here are that these are all these little, I don't know if you guys are familiar with flocking algorithms, but the idea is that all these little actors are on the move in this space, and they have rules for how they relate to each other. Right now I'm turning on these little points. The red cubes are targets for the flocking. So they're trying to form structures around these objects. So the idea is that these are some of the types of visual cueing that you could have. Actually, we'll go back to the regular flocking because these structures are a little bit too noisy. Basic flocking, maybe. Come back. There we go. So right now, those things are flocking around just the object that's active. And the idea is that potentially you could have some network overlay about the attention that people are having to certain subjects in your environment. So if you're sharing your sensorium and other people are looking through your sensorium at the environment, they could be sort of signaling their enthusiasm for different parts of the environment, almost like the little glowing arrows. Each of their visual actor in your overlay is a little flocking animal, and those animals could all sort of be focused on what things they're excited about and exerting flocking behavior. So they sort of start to highlight the scene for you in terms of the interest that you might have in the scene. So these are sort of the demos that we're working on that are about emergent behavior, about understanding complexity through play, and literacy in the type of complex systems that we're always embedded in, and how do you make metaphors allow people to understand those places. Thanks.